Hi guys, let's continue with part 3 of chapter 5, that is the age of industrialization. 4. Factories come up. The first cotton mill in Bombay came up in 1854. So it came up in 1854 and it went into production 2 years later. By 1862, four mills were at work. So by 1862, four mills were at work with 94,000 spindles and 2,150 looms. Around the same time, jute mills. So around this time, jute mills came up in Bengal, the first being set up in 1855 and another one 7 years later in 1862. In North India, the Elgin mill was started in Kanpur in the 1860s, and a year later, the first cotton mill of Ahmedabad was set up. By 1874, the first spinning and weaving mill of Madras began production. Who set up the industries? Where did the capital come from? Who came to work in the mills? We have a figure here. Figure 16. Jamsetji Jijibhoi. Jijibhoi was the son of a Parsi weaver. Like many others of his time, he was involved in the China trade and shipping. He owned a large fleet of ships, but competition from English and American shippers forced him to sell his ships by the 1850s. 4.1 The early entrepreneurs. Industries were set up in different reasons by varying sorts of people. Let us see who they were. The history of many business groups goes back to trade with China. From the late 18th century, as you have read in your book last year, the British in India began exporting opium to China and took tea from China to England. Many Indians became junior players. So many Indians became junior players in this trade, providing finance, procuring supplies, and shipping consignments. Having earned through trade, some of these businessmen had visions of developing industrial enterprises in India. In Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore made his fortune in the China trade before he turned to industrial investment, setting up six joint stock companies in the 1830s and 1840s. So in Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore, he made his fortune in the China trade and then he turned his focus into industrial development and he set up six joint stock companies in the 1830s and 1840s. Tagore's enterprises sank along with those of others in the wider business crisis of the 1840s, but later in the 19th century, many of the China traders became successful industrialists. In Bombay, Parsis like Dinso Petit and Jamsetji Nusarwanji Tata, who built huge industrial empires in India, accumulated their initial wealth partly from exports to China and partly from raw cotton shipments to England. Seth Hukum Chand. So there was Seth Hukum Chand, a Marwari businessman. So Seth Hukum Chand, a Marwari businessman who set up the first Indian jute mill in Calcutta in 1917. So he set up the first Indian jute mill in Calcutta in 1917, also traded with China. So did the father as well as grandfather of the famous industrialist G.D. Birla. So most of the industrialists where they gained their money first from trade with China. And we have here figure 17, Dwarkanath Tagore. Dwarkanath Tagore believed that India would develop through westernization and industrialization. He invested in shipping, shipbuilding, mining, banking, plantations, and insurance. Capital was accumulated through other trade networks. So, through other trade networks, also capital was accumulated. Some merchants from Madras traded with Burma. So, some merchants from Madras traded with Burma, while others had links with the Middle East and East Africa. There were yet other commercial groups, but they were not directly involved in external trade. They operated within India, carrying goods from one place to another, banking money, transferring funds between cities, and financing traders. When opportunities of investment in industries opened up, many of them set up factories. As colonial control over Indian trade tightened, the space within which Indian merchants could function became increasingly limited. They were barred from trading with Europe in manufactured goods and had to export mostly raw materials and food grains. Raw cotton, opium, wheat, and indigo required by the British. They were also gradually edged out of the shipping business. Here we have a figure. Figure 18, Partners in Enterprise, J.N. Tata, R.D. Tata, Sir R.J. Tata, and Sir D.J. Tata. In 1912, J.N. Tata set up the first iron and steel works in India at Jamshedpur. Iron and steel industries in India started much later than textiles. In colonial India, industrial machinery, railways, and locomotives were mostly imported. So capital goods industries could not really develop in any significant way till independence. Till the First World War, European managing agencies. So, till the First World War, European managing agencies in fact controlled a large sector of Indian industries. Three of the biggest ones were Bird, Hagglers and Company, Andrew Yule, and Jardine, Skinner and Company. These agencies mobilized capital, set up joint stock companies, and managed them. In most instances, Indian financiers provided the capital while the European agencies made all investment and business decisions. The European merchant industrialists had their own chambers of commerce, which Indian businessmen were not allowed to join. 4.2, Where did the workers come from? Factories needed workers. With the expansion of factories, this demand increased. In 1901, there were 584,000 workers in Indian factories. By 1946, the number was over 2,436,000. Where did the workers come from? In most industrial regions, workers came from the districts around. So the workers came from the districts around. Peasants and artisans who found no work in the village. So peasants and artisans who found no work in the village went to the industrial centers in search of work. Over 50% workers in the Bombay cotton industry in 1911 came from the neighboring districts of Ratnagiri, while the mills of Kanpur got most of their textile hands from the villages within the district of Kanpur. Most often, mill workers moved between the village and the city, returning to their village homes during harvest and festivals. Here we have a figure. Figure 19. Young workers of a Bombay mill, early 20th century. When workers went back to their village homes, they liked dressing up. Over time, as news of employment spread, workers traveled great distances in the hope of work in the mills. From the United Provinces, for instance, they went to work in the textile mills of Bombay and in the jute mills of Calcutta. Getting jobs was always difficult, even when mills multiplied and the demand for workers increased. The numbers seeking work were always more than the jobs available. So, the numbers seeking work were always more than the jobs available. Entry into the mills was also restricted. Industrialists usually employed a jobber, so they employed a jobber to get new recruits. Very often, the jobber was an old and trusted worker. He got people from his village, ensured them jobs, helped them settle in the city, and provided them money in times of crisis. The jobber therefore became a person with some authority and power. He began demanding money and gifts for his favor and controlling the lives of workers. The number of factory workers increased over time. However, as you will see, they were a small proportion of the total industrial workforce. So here we have a figure. Figure 20, a head jobber. Notice how the posture and clothes emphasize the jobber's position of authority. We have source E. Vasant Parkar, who was once a mill worker in Bombay, said, "The workers would pay the jobbers money to get their sons work in the mill. The mill worker was closely associated with his village, physically and emotionally. He would go home to cut the harvest and for sowing. The Konkani would go home to cut the paddy and the Ghati the sugar cane. It was an accepted practice for which the mills granted leave." We have a figure here. Figure 21. Spinners at work in an Ahmedabad mill. Women worked mostly in the spinning departments. Here is a source. Source F. Bhai Bhonsle. Bhai Bhosle, a trade unionist of Bombay, recollected his childhood in the 1930s and 1940s. In those days, the shift was 10 hours from 5 p.m. to 3 a.m. Terrible working hours. My father worked for 35 years. He got the asthma-like disease and could not work anymore. Then my father went back to village. 5. The peculiarities of industrial growth. European managing agencies which dominated industrial production in India were interested in certain kinds of products. They established tea and coffee plantations, acquired land at cheap rates from the colonial government, and they invested in mining, indigo, and jute. Most of these were products required primarily for export trade and not for sale in India. When Indian businessmen began setting up industries in the late 19th century, they avoided competing with Manchester goods in the Indian market. So they avoided competing with Manchester goods in the Indian market. Since yarn was not an important part of British imports into India, the early cotton mills in India produced coarse cotton yarn, that is the thread, rather than fabric. When yarn was imported, it was only of the superior variety. The yarn produced in Indian spinning mills was used by handloom weavers in India or exported to China. By the first decade of the 20th century, a series of changes affected the pattern of industrialization. As the Swadeshi movement gathered momentum, industrialists mobilized people to boycott foreign clothes. So, they boycott foreign clothes. Industrial groups organized themselves to protect their collective interest, pressurizing the government to increase tariff protection and grant other concessions. From 1906, moreover, the export of Indian yarn to China declined since produce from Chinese and Japanese mills flooded the Chinese market. So, industrialists in India began shifting from yarn to cloth production. So, they shifted from yarn to cloth production. Cotton piece goods production in India doubled between 1900 and 1912. Yet, till the First World War, industrial growth was slow. The war created a dramatically new situation, with British mills busy with war production to meet the needs of the army. Manchester imports into India declined. Suddenly, Indian mills had a vast home market to supply. As the war prolonged, Indian factories were called upon to supply war needs: jute bags, cloth for army uniforms, tents, and leather boots. How Tents and leather boots, horse and mule saddles, and a host of other items. We have here figure 22. So, this is the figure. The first office of the Madras Chamber of Commerce. By the late 19th century, merchants in different regions began meeting and forming chambers of commerce to regulate business and decide on the issues of collective concern. New factories were set up and old ones ran multiple shifts. Many new workers were employed and everyone was made to work longer hours. Over the war years, industrial production boomed. After the war, Manchester could never recapture its old position in the Indian market. Unable to modernize and compete with the US, Germany, and Japan, the economy of Britain crumbled after the war. Cotton production collapsed and export of cotton cloth from Britain fell dramatically. Within the colonies, local industrialists gradually consolidated their position, substituting foreign manufacturers and capturing the home market. 5.1 Small scale industries predominant. We have a figure here. Figure 23, a hand-woven cloth. The intricate designs of hand-woven cloth could not be easily copied by the mills. So 5.1 Small-scale industries predominant. While the factory industries grew steadily after the war, large industries formed only a small segment of the economy. Most of them, about 67% in 1911, were located in Bengal and Bombay. Over the rest of the country, small scale production continued to predominate. Only a small proportion of the total industrial labor force worked in registered factories, 5% in 1911 and 10% in 1931. The rest worked in small workshops and household units, often located in alleys and bylands, invisible to the passerby. In fact, in some instances, handicrafts production actually expanded in the 20th century. This is true even in the case of the handloom sector that we have discussed. While cheap machine made thread wiped out the spinning industry in the 19th century, the weavers survived despite problems. In the 20th century, handloom cloth production. So, in the 20th century, handloom cloth production expanded steadily, almost tripling between 1900 and 1940. What did or how did this happen? This was partly because of technological changes. Handicrafts people adopt new technology if that helps them improve production without excessively pushing up cost. So by the second decade of the 20th century, we find weavers using looms with fly shuttle. So what is this? Fly shuttle. A fly shuttle, it is a mechanical device used for weaving, moved by means of ropes and pulleys. It places the horizontal threads, called the weft, into the vertical threads, called the warp. The invention of the fly shuttle made it possible for weavers to operate large looms and weave wide pieces of cloth. This increased productivity per worker speeded up production and reduced labor demand. By 1941, over 35% of handlooms in India were fitted with fly shuttles. In regions like Travancore, Madras, Mysore, Cochin, Bengal, the proportion was 70 to 80%. There were several other small innovations that helped weavers improve their productivity and compete with the mill sectors. Certain groups of weavers were in a better position than others to survive the competition with mill industries. Amongst weavers, some produced coarse cloth while others wove finer varieties. The coarser cloth was bought by the poor and its demand fluctuated violently. In times of bad harvests and famines, when the rural poor had little to eat and their cash income disappeared, they could not possibly buy clothes. The demand for the finer varieties bought by the well to do was more stable. Okay, so the coarser cloth was bought by the poor and its demand fluctuated violently, and the demand for the finer varieties bought by the well to do was more stable. The rich could buy these even when the poor starved. Famines did not affect the sale of Banarasi or Baluchari saris. Moreover, as you have seen, mills could not imitate specialist weaves. Saris with woven borders or the famous lungis and handkerchiefs of Madras could not be easily displaced by mill production. Weavers and other craftspeople who continued to expand production through the 20th century did not necessarily prosper. So, weavers and other craftspeople who continued to expand production through the 20th century did not necessarily prosper. They lived hard lives and worked long hours. Very often, the entire household, including all the women and children, had to work at various stages of the production process. But they were not simply remnants of past times in the age of factories. Their life and labor was integral to the process of industrialization. Figure 24. Location of large-scale industries in India, 1931. The circles indicate the size of industries in the different regions. So these are the location of large-scale industries. Mostly are there in Bengal and Bombay, and some are there in Madras, Central Provinces, Bihar, United Provinces, and Punjab. 6. Market for goods. We have seen how British manufacturers attempted to take over the Indian market and how Indian weavers and craftsmen, traders and industrialists resisted colonial controls, demanded tariff protection, created their own spaces and tried to extend the market for their produce. But when new products are produced, people have to be persuaded to buy them. They have to feel like using the product. How was this done? One way in which new consumers are created is through advertisement. So, one way in which new consumers are created is through advertisement. As you know, advertisements make products appear desirable and necessary. They try to shape the minds of people and create new needs. Today, we live in a world where advertisements surround us. They appear in newspapers, magazines, hoardings, street walls, television screens. But if we look back into history, we find that from the very beginning of the industrial age, advertisements have played a part in expanding the markets for products and in shaping a new consumer culture. Figure 25. So, Grip Water Calendar of 1928 by M.V. Durandhar. The image of baby Krishna was most commonly used to popularize baby products. When Manchester industrialists began selling clothes in India, they put labels on the cloth bundles. The label was needed to make the place of manufacture and the name of the company familiar to the buyer. The label was also to be a mark of quality. When buyers saw "Made in Manchester" written in bold on the label, they were expected to feel confident about buying the clothes. Here we have another figure, figure 26A and figure 26B. Figure 26A. Manchester labels, early 20th century. Images of numerous Indian gods and goddesses. Kartika, Lakshmi, Saraswati are shown in imported cloth labels, proving the quality of the product being marketed. Figure 26B. Maharaja Ranjit Singh on a Manchester label. Historic figures are used to create respect for the product. But labels did not only carry words and text, they also carried images and were very often beautifully illustrated. If we look at these old labels, we can have some idea of the mind of the manufacturers, their calculations, and the way they appealed to the people. Images of Indian gods and goddesses regularly appeared in these labels. It was as if the association with gods gave divine approval to the goods being sold. The imprinted image of Krishna or Saraswati was also intended to make the manufacture from a foreign land appear somewhat familiar to Indian people. We have a figure here, Sunlight Soap. Figure 27, Sunlight Soap Calendar of 1934. Here, God Vishnu is shown bringing sunlight from across the skies. By the late 19th century, manufacturers were printing calendars to popularize their products. So they were printing calendars to popularize their products. Unlike newspapers and magazines, calendars were used even by people who could not read. They were hung in tea shops and in poor people's homes just as much as in offices and middle class apartments. And those who hung the calendars had to see the advertisements day after day through the year. In these calendars, once again, we see the figures of gods being used to sell new products. Like the images of God, figures of important personages of emperors and nawabs adorned advertisement and calendars. The message very often seemed to say, if you respect the royal figure, then respect this product. When the product was being used by kings or produced under royal command, its quality could not be questioned. So we have a figure here. Figure 28. An Indian mill cloth label. The goddess is shown offering cloth produced in an Ahmedabad mill and asking people to use things made in India. When Indian manufacturers advertised, the nationalist message was clear and loud. If you care for the nation, then buy products that Indians produce. Advertisements became a vehicle of the nationalist message of Swadeshi. Conclusion. Clearly, the age of industries had meant major technological changes, growth of factories, and the making of a new industrial labor force. However, as you have seen, hand technology and small scale production remained an important part of the industrial landscape. Look again in figures 1 and 2. What would you say? What would you now say of the images they project? So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.